Natalia Rodriguez, and I'll be playing the lead investigator 1.
And I am Angela Rodriguez, and I will be playing the lead investigator 2, and we will be presenting our case study on the relationship between adolescents who play violent video games
and the impact on aggression, tendency towards violence, and social isolation. Hello. Hi, how are you? Oh, really? Okay, we'll get right on. Angela, the Secretary of Human Health Services wants us to see if there's an association between adolescents who play violent video games and aggression prone to violence and social isolation.
Oh my gosh, how are we going to do that? I guess we can conduct a systematic review. It is the highest level of evidence, and we can incorporate the Bradford Hill criteria. It would be better than conducting an individual study.
That's right. The Bradford Hill criteria has been widely used in epidemiological studies and consists of 9 aspects of association that show causation.
Right, but due to the limitations of the systematic review, we will only be doing 5 out of 9.
True. Works for me, though.
Let's do it.
So why is any of this important? With recent school shootings and violent events in the United States, people have begun questioning the reasons behind such atrocities. This map incorporates Google data 2014 to show all the school shootings from 1992 to 2014.
The points here represent 378 reported school shootings. Not all reports have involved injury or death or have been reported in the media.
Many studies have currently examined the relationship between violent video game play and violence in real life, but few reviews exist that show relevance and relationship across studies.
The objective of our case study is to conduct a systematic review that examines the link between aggression, prone to violence, social isolation among teenagers and adolescents while incorporating the Bradford Hill criteria. For systematic review, we first had to define our dependent and independent variables using the U.S. National Library method. Our inclusion criteria consisted of time frame from 2000 to current time, adolescents, teenagers, young adults, video games, computers, arcades, aggression, violence, and social isolation. For our exclusion criteria, we listed foreign language, child studies, review articles, document type, and animal studies. The databases we used consisted of Scopus, PubMed, All Academic Complete, and PsycInfo. A total of 910 records were pulled up from our search. After duplicates were removed, and after we excluded non-relevant articles, we were left with a total of 38 articles.
Epidemiological studies that measured the association between the independent variable and dependent variables were selected. Of the 38 studies that we were left with, we created an evidence table and abstracted variables from each of the studies that included the author, the year, country, study design, the number of participants, the population, the exposure variables, and outcome variables, main findings, and study quality. In order to assess the quality and strength of each study, we used the quality assessment tool for quantitative studies. Each study was ranked as either being weak, strong, or moderate in terms of quality. We also created a second table for the Bradford Hill criteria, where we included 5 of the criteria for causation, which included strength, consistency, temporality, dose response, and biological plausibility.
Hi everyone, thank you for attending the U.S. National Conference. For our systematic review, we measured the strength of the relationship among the studies. There were 30 studies that measured the association between violent video games and aggression. 25 found a positive association and 5 did not. For violent video games and prone to violence, only 5 articles were populated, all of which showed a positive association. For social isolation and violent video game play, only 3 articles were found, all of which showed a positive association as well. We also screened for consistency. Consistency was seen across all the studies except for 5 that measured the association between video game violence and aggression that were not consistent.
Hello everyone, welcome. I'll take over from here on out. So the next Bradford Hill criteria that we assessed was temporality, which basically states that the risk factors to precede the disease. Unfortunately, less than half the studies could show clear lines of temporality, but they were also not testing for temporality. Of the 30 studies that were examining video game play and aggression, 9 studies were able to show temporality, while 11 were not. Of the 5 studies that looked at video game play and tendency towards violence, 3 studies were able to show temporality. And of the last 3 studies that looked at video game play and social isolation, 2 studies were able to establish temporality. The next Bradford Hill criteria that we assessed was dose response.
Evidence of dose-response relationship between a risk factor and an outcome is crucial in the study because this value tells you whether or not the results found increase with exposure. In addition, it clarifies the question of how strong the link between exposure and outcome is. So low dosage is defined as no dose response or not being tested. Moderate exposure is up to 1 hour, and high dose is any exposure that is more than 1 hour. Of the total 38 studies that we examined, 11 found a high dose response for those that played video games. 7 studies found a moderate dose response, meaning an hour or less of video game time. And the largest proportion of the studies, which was approximately 20, found a low dose response. However, none of these studies were testing for dose response either. The last Bradford Hill criteria that we assessed was biological plausibility. And this is basically whether the presence of a potential biological mechanism exists for an association or relationship between an exposure and an outcome. A biological model was created for the possible biological mechanisms for the association between the outcome and the exposure that we were looking at. Not all studies used the exact same models, but we were able to fit all the models listed within 2 studies. These models were combined and will be shown later. Of the 30 studies that were looking at video game play and aggression, 22 were able to show possible mechanisms. Of 5 studies that looked at video game play and tendency towards violence, 4 were able to show biological models. And interestingly, none of the studies that examined violent video game play and social isolation listed a biological model or mentioned how the relationship would fit into a possible mechanism.
So for the biological plausibility, we put 2 models together. The first model is composed of multiple brain imaging studies put together by Sturzer. The second model is composed of the general aggression model. In the brain, we have multiple areas that have decreased regulation. We have decreased regulation in the temporal parietal cortex, which is responsible for performance monitoring. We have the anterior cingulate cortex responsible for cognitive control, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex responsible for reinforcement learning, the orbitofrontal cortex responsible for emotion regulation, and the amygdala, which is responsible for emotion recognition. Of these, the anterior cortex and the orbitofrontal cortex impact from the amygdala and repeated violent video game playing. This impacts aggressive beliefs, aggressive perpetual schemata, aggressive expectations, aggressive behavior, and aggressive desensitization, all which increase aggressive personality, which in turn impacts personological variables and situational variables that lead to aggression, violence, and social isolation.
So in conclusion, based on a systematic review of the literature, we were able to find 38 studies that measured aggression, tendency towards violence, and social isolation in adolescents who played violent video games. 33 of these studies found positive associations, and of the 5 that found no association, all were looking at aggression. 25 studies looked at aggression, while 5 examined tendency towards violence, and 3 were found that measured social isolation. All 8 studies for tendency towards violence and social isolation found positive associations in their relationships. Bradford Hill criteria were assessed for each study to examine causality. Limitations of the study included several authors that published the same studies, whether search results included articles or excluded articles, and studies with low statistical power. Regardless of limitations, the evidence is still strong for establishing causality between video game playing among adolescents, 13 to 18 years old, and aggression, tendency towards violence, and social isolation, and should be considered in policy-making decisions on video games. Based on the facts stated in this review today, our recommendations for video game laws targeting adolescents and young adults aged 13 to 18 would include adding a warning label and adjusting game ratings. This warning should notify purchasers that playing games longer than 1 hour or playing games with high violent content will increase aggression, tendency towards violence, and social isolation. Thank you for your time.